everything in my power to be there. I sat in the airport for 3.5 hours while I watched a gradual drift into cancellation. Thanks. I rehearsed that a long time. Yeah, so it started out with a 30-minute delay, which would have been fine. I had plenty of time. It was going to work fine. Then we went to the elusive 35-minute delay, which I'm not really sure what that means because the airline, I mean, it's 5 minutes. Then we went to an hour. I started getting worried. Then we went to 2 hours. I started getting worried. Then we went to 3 hours. The plane eventually left. I gave up, but it eventually left 6 hours and 40 minutes late. So there you go. I was not going to make it. And I think it's a really interesting airports. I'm sure I'm speaking for you, but let me stop if I need to. How incredibly brittle that system is. It is, you're basically one errant weird weather event from not going to where you guys are. But you'll have to have fun without me. I'm sad though, because this is always the great reunion and the chance to get to see lots of people that I've known for years. And even more importantly, the chance to meet everybody new. And so if I've not met you before, let's consider this a real meeting and have some fun with it. I can't wait to have a little talk with you. I've thought a lot about this presentation, and I should tell you, I wanted to start it with an activity, but that's not going to work out so well. So I'm kind of going to jump into it. But I want to talk a little bit about how I'd share with you, because I think it's worth noting, is how the world has changed around us. And there's a lot to be said there. We could talk about a ton about changes, and we've talked about it before. But the one I want to sort of focus on now is how interesting these ideas that were once kind of controversial and novel and new have become in the mainstream conversation globally around the way people create resilience and reliability in their organizations. And to a great extent, I want to look right at you. That's me looking right at you. See my eyes? There they are. And say thank you. Because over time and through lots of effort, because change is hard, we've created an environment where this conversation offends me when I work with companies that don't do it the way we do it. It seems like it's malpractice. And I think that's a really interesting comment. And it's a comment that we can make because that means the ideas we have are becoming more and more mainstream. And that's good, that's valuable. But with it comes some pitfalls. And that's what I wanted to share with you guys today. If we have an opportunity and you can gut through this, I think it's worth it. But I want to start with this idea. So behind me, you see this, things that never happen all the time. And I want to tell a story because I think I can only get away telling this story to you. I probably couldn't tell this story to anybody else and get away with it. But a couple weeks ago, I was flying back from a meeting. I'd done some big meeting someplace, and I was flying back to my hometown, back to Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I got on the plane, and everything was great, and it was perfect. And I was connecting, and once again, a slow drift to delay. And my plane ended up being really, really late, and I had to fly in. I was supposed to get in at like 7 p.m., and I got in at like 12:30 a.m. the next day. And so that happens. That's a part of the risk. No challenge, no big deal. I had gone out for one quick meeting. I'd left the day before. I spoke that morning. I got on the plane and I flew back. So I wasn't even going to be gone 24 hours. I got in my car in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and I drove to Santa Fe. It's about an hour. And by the time I got to Santa Fe, it was about 1:30 in the morning. And I pulled into my driveway. The house is dark. The whole city's dark. I mean, pretty much Santa Fe rolls the sidewalks up by about 8:30. And I noticed this weird thing, you guys. When I pulled into my driveway, there was a duffel bag and a roller suitcase parked along the edge of my house. Now, a better person, and you're going to hear me say that several times, probably would have taken note and seen that as a big change. That is a weak signal indicator that something's going on. But it was 1:30 in the morning. I was really tired. I was super delayed, kind of angry, and I had to go to the bathroom. So I thought, I'll just deal with that tomorrow. That clearly is going to be maybe stolen goods or somebody lost something or it fell off a truck. I'll just deal with it. It's going to be fine. It's 1:30 in the morning. It's still there. I'll take care of it the next morning. So I jump out of my car. I go into my house. The door's locked. Everything's fine. I open the door and I walk in and I go directly to the comfort chamber. The same thing you would do after you went on a long trip. And when I went to the restroom, I noticed the toilet paper was gone. Now, I do talk a lot about toilet paper. I know it's kind of a theme I carry, but for some weird reason, that sort of hit my brain as noteworthy. I came out of the restroom. I walked back through the house and I thought, something seems odd to me. So I turned on a couple lights, and sure enough, you guys, in the guest bedroom in my house, the door was wide open. There was a burglar asleep on my guest bed. And around him on the bed were many different small items that he was clearly prepared to steal, and the toilet paper. Well, this is the part where I want to offer things that never happen all the time. And this is the part where I should talk to you lots about identifying weak signal indicators, help you to better predict what's going on within your house or your company or your organization. But instead, I don't know what happened, but the light was on. There was a person sleeping on top of the covers on the bed with many stolen items around him. Instead, what I should have done was left the house, got in my car, and called the police. But what I did do was say, "What are you doing in my house?" Which was a very interesting thing to do because it completely startled my burglar. Like, I mean, scared the crap out of him. I mean, he was visibly shook up, and he got up and he jumped to his feet and he grabbed all the stuff around him on the bed. And I said, "Drop all that stuff. That's not yours. That's mine." And then he ran by me, ran out the door, grabbed the roller bag and the duffel bag, and ran out into the street. So then I called the police. And what's interesting is that the police came really quickly because they respond to stuff like that pretty quickly. And they walked through the house. And I noticed something really interesting, that the burglar clearly had been in my house a while and had gone through many things, but didn't really steal anything. In fact, what was stolen was kind of sad. He stole all my deodorants, all my toothpaste, toilet paper. He stole things that I think sadly he needed to live. But one thing he did do was make some food. He really made himself at home at my place. And he made a bowl of cereal. Now, he used all of the half and half in my refrigerator, which was tragic, and all of the whipping cream, which I don't even know how old that. I didn't even know I had whipping cream in the refrigerator, so that was kind of a mystery. And he made cereal in a bowl. The weird thing is, the cereal he made wasn't from my house. It was some kind of fancy gluten-free cereal that he brought with him and left the box. So if you need 3/4 of a box of gluten-free cereal, I have it. I mean, come over and I'll give it to you. He clearly ate his food, and then he did something amazing. He put his dirty dishes in the sink. Now, I tell you the story because I think it's a pretty good reflection on me. It's a really good reflection on what it's like to be fatigued after you've gone on a trip that goes really wrong and you're super late. And I think it's kind of a nice reflection on my burglar. I mean, at least he was polite enough to put his dirty dishes in the sink. What I think is amazing is that this story illustrates almost perfectly what we talk about every single day. When faced with uncertainty, do we have the capacity to manage what's in front of us? And I'm not especially proud of what I did. I learned, though, that's the key of the entire conference you're attending. And if this happens again, and let's hope it doesn't, but if it does happen again, I fully am prepared this time to go to my car, lock the door, call the police, and respond with a much different way. Oh, how he got in? Well, that's because the back door was unlocked. That's probably a different story for another presentation. But it sort of helps me introduce what I wanted to introduce. And this presentation was sort of set up to deliver to you guys in real life. But this is my new current bio slide. I don't know if you can see it very well behind my shoulder. Let me sort of focus on what's going on there. After the burglar story I just told you, it probably makes pretty good sense that I identify the characters in my bio photo. So this is me, and this is the elephant butt. Try to not confuse them, because after that story, it seems like they at least could be interchangeable, at least at some level, but they probably aren't. Let's forge ahead and talk about what I want to talk about. So I really want to kick off with sort of 3 secrets. And I think it's time that we have this 3 secret discussion, because I think this is helpful to where we are on the journey collectively as a community. And one of the things that we've done for years is really help present these ideas as new and novel, and help organizations sort of immediately digest early adoption of some changing ideas. But as I said earlier in my introduction, one of the things that's happening is that more and more organizations around the globe, in fact, organizations that you maybe even attended a conference for last week, it's being really normalized to look at the work we do and talk about it the way we've always talked about it. And I think there are 3 secret weapons that we have, 3 secret tools, 3 secret ways to think about that change that have made the biggest difference for me. And I want to share them with you, because I think this sort of sets the stage for how we move forward. First and foremost, I think the biggest secret we have is the ability to understand and start this discussion where the group is in this thinking, not where we are in this thinking. So part of what I would suggest as maybe a critique that we can think about and take seriously is the fact that for the most part, we've thought about these ideas for a long, long time. And when we see a newscast, or when we read a story, or when we see an event happen in an organization, we immediately jump to probably a different level in our thinking about that event and our ability to learn from that event than probably the rest of the organization does. And that's not a bad thing. That's a normal thing. And so part of our challenge is to understand that we don't start our discussion around organizational learning and improvement at the maturity level we're at now. We have to start that discussion at the beginning. And I always kind of think of it like this. Our job is to attach new knowledge to old knowledge. And the only way we can attach new knowledge to old knowledge is to really understand and start where the group is, not where we are, but where the group is. And to do that, we have to sort of test and analyze and have conversations and understand what that starting place is. But it's incredibly valuable not to jump in immediately into, for instance, a conversation around just culture or psychological safety if we haven't actually done the fundamental discussions around shifting the way we think about and understanding resilience, reliability, safety, performance excellence, all the things we manage. And so maybe one of the most powerful secrets I can share with you is the secret that says you're going to have to start at the beginning. And it's boring for you because you've already had those ideas. You're going to have to give the same presentation and tell the same story many times for many, many years, because everybody that goes on this journey with us has to start at the beginning of the journey and then move to a level where we can have the more advanced discussions. That's key. And it's a big lesson for us. You can't start at the end and hope they'll catch up. Your job is to provide ways for them to be a part of the journey with you. And that makes a big difference. And that secret is really, really powerful. That's secret one. Secret two says the group owns both the problem and therefore the solution. Now, this one, I can't say this enough times because every organization you've ever been a part of, and that's a big assumption I'm making saying this, but every organization you've ever been a part of is sort of secretly hunting for the silver bullet, the magic elixir, the Harry Potter wand that can actually make the problem go away with the least amount of effort, the most amount of efficiency, in a clean way that makes everybody, board, leaders, stakeholders, customers, and clients happy. The bottom line is we all know that's not true. It's the argument I've had my entire career around leading data. Everyone wants leading data. I really want leading data. Well, the reason they want leading data is pretty simple. We want to make uncertainty certain. We want to know every time a burglar's in our house sleeping on our guest bed. We'd like to know that before we enter the house. So we should be able to predict that, right? In retrospect, looking at the duffel bag and the suitcase in my driveway, there was plenty of data there. And everybody I've told that story to says the same thing to me. Well, if I'd have seen that, I'd have reacted. I'd have probably immediately reacted. I'd have been on alert. Well, maybe. I mean, I don't know. I wasn't, but maybe you're a better person than I am. The bottom line is that ultimately there is no quick answer. And this really holds true when you think about working with your organization. And all of you guys in this room are so experienced with working within your organization and other organizations that in many ways, this conversation is a little bit like preaching to the choir. And yet, I would suggest the choir pretty much practices every Wednesday night just to make sure they sound good on Sunday morning, right? That idea that the group owns the problem, therefore leads to the necessity in understanding that the group must also own the solution. And so part of our challenge is to create a dialogue that helps the group analyze and understand their problem so they can learn from what is going on in order to create a solution for that. And all of that has to happen within a process within the organization. I'll give you an example. It's a good one because most of you in the room today, in that fancy ballroom with chandeliers, will understand this. A corrective action that is handed down to you, that is given as if it's an edict towards creating change, is probably not going to be nearly as an effective corrective action as one that you develop within a group that has the problem. When we offer corrective actions from fix the wrong thing effectively, but when we create corrective actions from the inside out, what happens is we spend more time learning, and that therefore reduces the amount of time that we have in fixing. That's entirely a function of the fact that the group owns the problem. And so logic says they also have to own the solution. And that's really, really, really key, which takes me to the third secret. And there's only three. So, I mean, don't get too freaked out. This list isn't very long. And that is, we can never forget the first principles. And to a great extent, part of the reason I told Charles I would gladly be a part of this meeting and was excitedly going to fly to ORF, which is the best airport abbreviation for Norfolk in the world, was because I wanted to have this conversation. The more I listen to stories about this new way of thinking, the more I'm starting to see some drift in places where I don't understand why it's going. Like a lot of times I'm seeing repackaged BBS programs sold as kind of new view human performance programs, and they aren't. Now, I don't mean that to sound offensive, and I hope I didn't make anyone angry. But one of the things that's missing is something that's fundamental to the engineers, researchers, scientists in your organization. And that's the power in understanding first principles. Now, first principles, we'll define them in a moment, but first principles really say, what is the basic truth that we're shifting the organization to understand? And how is that basic truth, that basic assumption, that basic piece of information, how's it supported and understood? And where did it come from? And what's interesting is whenever you're faced with a challenge and you don't really know the answer, but it feels like there must be a solution to this, what science will tell you, and there are many of you in the room who represent science, what science will tell you is you always go back to the first principles. Understand the problem better, and therefore you'll create much more effective solutions. Now, that belief in first principles is a really powerful part of what I want to talk to you about. And then there's one more bonus one, because I told you there's only 3 secrets. So this isn't really a secret. This is the promise. And the bonus promise I want you to think about is pretty simple. I think our biggest challenge now is that we have to stop having conversations that make us dumber. And I'm not sure dumber is a word. I mean, I probably should say stop having conversations that make us less smart, but dumber's got a little more impact. And that challenge is really an important challenge because to a great extent, lots of the conversations that we've had in our world have really spent time dumbing problems down, dumbing the nuance down, dumbing the context down. And part of that challenge is that if we have conversations that make us dumber, the outcome is that we become dumb. In fact, what I want to suggest is we want to have conversations that actually move us towards improvement. And so our default position, no matter what happens, is that we get better. Our job is to help our organizations improve. It's that simple. Now, we happen to know that the way they're going to improve is by creating the opportunity to effectively learn on a continuous basis. And to get them to do that, we have to think differently. And thinking differently is a big part of the challenge, which takes us right back to first principles. Now, first principles, this is the definition. First principles are one of the fundamental assumptions on which a particular theory or practice is thought. It's the fundamental underpinning of what change looks like. And if you ask me to define a first principles for us, the one I would go to, because it's the one I think about all the time, and it's the one you've been a part of this journey and a part of this change for many years. I mean, you're all incredibly young and super good looking, but think about how old Rob Fisher is. Just think about it. And you know he's one depend diaper away from teaching a full class. Let's just put that out there. But part of our challenge is if we think about our first principles, the one that comes to my mind is this one. We help shift the world. And I don't mean that egotistically, and I don't mean it that our job is done, and I don't mean that we're so great that nobody else can touch us, although I would suggest as a collective group, there's about 215 people in that room that are pretty darn great. I would suggest that this is a real first principle idea, that safety itself is not the absence of accidents, that safety is the presence of safeguards, or as we've come to sort of create, the presence of capacity. And that notion that safety creates a presence, that safety is not the absence of something bad, it's the presence of something good, that is a first principle idea. And that actually is foundational to creating the change that we've worked so diligently for so long to help create. Now, remember, the group owns the problem, so they have to own the solution, and we have to start where the group is. Well, a big part of that challenge is realizing that this little phrase, the one you see behind me right here, that little phrase is in many ways earth shattering because it runs counter to what we've constantly said for years and years and years and years and years and years, is that the way we measure safety is by the absence of failure. This really has created this new conversation. And the new conversation we're having actually helps organizations improve. So it sort of meets our test. It goes back to our first principles as a community, which is the ability to help organizations learn. And it meets the first principles of kind of understanding system stability and resilience at a much better level. And it helps shift thinking at a first principles level, at a fundamental philosophical change. So part of what all of us have suffered with is when we bring these ideas to our organization, they want it to be a program. They want it to have spinning charts and all sorts of things, and you can touch it and you can. And we've always said this is more of a philosophical shift and less of a programmatic shift. In fact, one of the coolest advantages we have is the fact that these ideas can be used in any existing program to help that existing program get better at analyzing and learning from itself and creating improvement. Well, that shift is because at a fundamental level, the first principles level, what we're shifting is really the definition of our outcome. And so when I say in the three big secrets, always go back to first principles, that's where I want you to really go. Is we have to go back to the idea that safety is not taking bad things out of the organization. Safety is putting good things in the organization. It doesn't make it harder to have an accident. It makes it easier to be resilient. And that shift, which remember for us is a conversation we've had both with people and in our brains for a long time, that conversation is pretty new. Now, how do we build that understanding of the first principles? Well, that part I think has been really interesting. And that journey's been a part of it. And one of the ways that I found is to really understand that there are the 5 principles of human performance, right? And you know these. So that isn't going to be terribly novel, but I think we need to talk about them because this part, I think, is the part where we're seeing the most change happen. So if you remember correctly, back in the olden days, back when everybody was young and thin and had lots of hair and super happy. Remember those days? You could eat anything you wanted. Onions didn't keep you awake at night. Those days. Remember those old days? We started with a set of principles that were sort of created through a series of really thoughtful, brilliant people who sort of served as the foundation. And those principles over time have morphed and changed and adapted. And I think that's normal, but they need to always be able to anchor back to that first principle idea. And so what's happened now is that we're seeing these principles move. But my challenge to you, and I really want you to think about it, is that we're doing a tremendous amount of work with organizations and not ever really talking about the fundamental principles. And so therefore, the organization doesn't have the benefit to go back and redefine from the first principles level what's happening. So when things get rough, when things get tough, and organizations all ebb and flow, they move forward and backward, they don't have that foundation to land on to recalibrate and start again. So the challenge is if we start with the solution, we've taken away the ability to do the learning. And so you remember this because we've talked about it before, but the answer is always the enemy of the question. And so if we give people answers, then what they lose is the ability to formulate the question. And if they can't formulate the question, then it becomes really difficult to learn. In fact, it becomes almost unnecessary to take the time to learn because you already think you know what the problem is. And if you think about examples of that, that's how we drifted over time to pretty much an entirely worker-centric understanding of failure. The organization had an event because the worker failed to meet the espoused expectations of the organization. And that held a lot of water for a long, long time until it didn't. Things that never happen all the. You'll know things that never happen all the time. The next time you go to your house and there's a burglar in your guest bedroom. Let's just put that out there. But these 5 principles, they're sort of worth talking about, and they're simple, right? People make mistakes. We understand that one completely. Blame fixes nothing. And in fact, my favorite phrase, which comes exactly from you guys, is that what blame really does is stop learning. Blame stops learning. Blame halts improvement. Learning is vital. It's everything. Behavior is a function of context. That's kind of a new idea adapted from the old principles. And then last but not least, how leaders react makes a difference. Let's talk about these, but let's not talk fundamentally about the principle because we understand the principle. Let's talk about what's going on in these principles that make it happen. And let's start with the first one, because the first one in my mind is the most interesting. And in fact, remember I said earlier, you're going to have the same conversation a million times for many, many, many years. This is the one that I probably have spent the most amount of time talking about. And probably I'm not done talking about this. The good news is I don't find this tedious. And the more I talk about mistakes, the more I learn and understand human nature at a better level, at least for me. And one of the challenges when we say people make mistakes is really moving the organization away from the fundamental attribution bias, which the fundamental attribution bias basically says a better worker would have made a better decision. We have to move them slowly and surely away from that fundamental attribution bias in order to have a conversation that equates into learning. And so over the years, and I've thought about this so much, over the years, I think the most important message that I've come up with in this idea around mistakes is probably also the most simple one, but I think it's the one we miss, and it's this one. Human error is not a choice. And so if we look at the idea that workers have free will, or maybe a better way to say that is that workers exercise agency within the organization, which I think that's entirely up for debate and discussion. And I'm hoping Ron Gant takes this squarely on the minute I shut off the computer and go back to sleep. Okay. I hope he just takes it squarely on next. But the idea that somehow workers have the ability to choose to not do something is a pretty important thing for us to think about. Every worker that's ever fallen through a hatch, and for some reason, I've done a whole bunch of events where workers fall through hatches. And many times, sadly, they fall to their death. So it's a pretty serious thing. But anytime a person falls into a hole, you can just kind of at a basic level realize that they didn't do that because they chose to. They did it because they thought the hole was not a hole. The only way you can step into an open hatch is to believe that the hatch is not open. That's the only way. I mean, if you thought it was open, you wouldn't step in there. You might accidentally fall in there, but for the most part, the events I've looked at, the people sort of walked to their demise. The important realization for us at a fundamental level is that error is not a choice. And if error is not a choice, then asking workers to not make mistakes is not going to be effective. And so all the hours and hours and hours and hours and hours we've spent telling workers to be more accurate, to be more careful, to take to try harder, to jump faster, to be better, that time is like sitting in an airport for 3.5 hours. It's a moment of your life you're not getting back. And it actually makes the conversation dumber, not smarter. In fact, if we were really going to focus on this and make conversation smarter, make learning more effective, one of the big shifts we'd have to take into this is that the organization itself doesn't do anything, not jack squat, to quote what the kids are saying, in managing error. It just doesn't. It doesn't manage error. It can't manage error because error is not a choice. And if error is not a choice, then you can't ask people to not make mistakes. So you can't manage error. What organizations manage are that error likely situation, those error prone events. They manage the consequence of the inevitable error that's going to happen in a system. So when a failure takes place, one of the fundamental discussions that you have to have, and I know you're having this, but one of the fundamental discussions you have to have is not the novelty of the worker mistake, but the fragility of the system in which the mistake was made. And that idea that if you come and tell a story of a worker who screwed up and it had a big consequence to operations, or a big consequence to production, or a big consequence to quality, the most interesting part of that story is not the fact that the worker made a mistake. In fact, this room, you guys collectively, are a really good crowd to sort of understand that that's probably the most predictable part of the entire event. That part just happens. The most interesting part of the story is that the worker was in an environment where one mistake could lead to that consequence, to perhaps even a catastrophic consequence. And so our challenge is that we really, at a fundamental level, when we talk about error, are really talking about this idea of free agency and the fact that workers don't exercise choice when they make a mistake. A mistake is an unintended deviation from an expected outcome. It's a mistake. That's exactly, it's a surprise. Had they known differently, they absolutely would have done. Had I known there was no hatch cover on the place I'm about to step, I would not step there. And that part of the discussion is vital. Now, that is the first principle, and it's remained the first principle for many, many, many years. And yet I would suggest part of our challenge is that we see that as so simple and so basic that we kind of no longer spend the time building the first principle discussion around why this matters. And it matters a ton. It matters an entire great amount because it really leads us into principle 2. Now, principle 2, the idea that blame fixes nothing or blame stops learning, principle 2 is valuable and consistent. It's been around since the beginning, and it's a really important idea because what it does is it helps us actually move the focus away from the person who touched the object last to a much more holistic understanding of the context-rich environment in which the failure took place. But here's where this gets tricky, and you guys know this, and if you didn't, today's going to be a big day, is the relationship between principle 1 and principle 2 is almost inseparable. In fact, one can't live without the other. You cannot talk about blame until you talk about the fact that mistakes are not choices. But you can't talk about human error without talking about the idea of blame. And so what's crazy, at least to me, you may not think it's crazy, but to me, what's so interesting is that these two principles must coexist at the same time, which is kind of what coexist means if you're following along at home, right? They live in parallel. They're in absolutely inseparably connected to one another. And so in order for you to be successful at actually helping people be better at learning, you must first help people redefine the notion of success, the presence of capacity, and then next help them understand the fact that error is not a choice. Are you starting to see where this first principle discussion starts to make its money? Why scientists everywhere or engineers everywhere talk about going back to first principles, because it's so fundamental to the way we develop. Now, I'm just going to say this, and I don't mean to offend, although I'm really far away. And if I were going to offend you, this would be the time to do it. But I think part of our challenge in organizations that are having a difficult time diffusing these new ideas is that we haven't spent enough time on these issues. If something happens and they believe the worker failed the organization, then, and it's not sabotage and it's not criminal, then what that tells us is that we didn't do a good job meeting the group where they are. Top secret tool number one. Now, that challenge is a big one. And it means that we have to sort of constantly have this relationship between error and blame. But to me, the power is that it helps us really shift the way we think about workers. And so this phrase, which you've heard a million times, we have to stop seeing the worker as the problem to be fixed and start seeing the worker as a solution to draw upon. This is, at least in my opinion, and I would certainly open this up to discussion, because I think this should be a kind of an interesting part of the discussions you guys have. This is fundamentally the first principles of organizational learning, is that when we learn by understanding the workers are a source of information and not a source of the problem, then it allows us to get deeper, more profound understanding of how our work is done. Because after all, if you want to know how work is done, who do you talk to? The people who do the work. And what's so funny about that is that that's always true. It's true for us. It's true for every leader that's in your organization at any level. And it's really true globally. It doesn't really define itself by cultural boundaries. It's never defined itself by geographical boundaries. It's sort of a fundamental first principle notion that the people who touch the system have the most profound knowledge of how the system works. Now, that runs counter to lots of traditional thinking. That runs counter to classic Tayloristic ideas. Frederick Taylor, who said we have to clearly separate working from thinking. But ultimately, what we're doing is reinvigorating, rejuvenating, almost a Renaissance thinking around how we see the workers. But it's fundamentally tied back to this idea. The belief somehow that human error is a choice stops us from learning and starts us into blame. Ultimately, I think the challenge is the belief that another worker would have made a better choice. Or had it been me, had I been doing the work, when I saw the suitcase in the driveway, I would not have gone into the house. That's crazy. You're nuts. But ultimately, that's not the case. Now, the crazy thing about principle one and principle two is that oftentimes the most egregious transpirers of these ideas are the people who've had the event themselves. And so my last word around blame and error is that you're going to have to be very, very, very thoughtful in having discussions with the leadership in your organization. And they will be iterative discussions. You'll slowly but surely make progress, and you'll have them what seems like a billion times. But you'll also have to have this same discussion with the workers who have failures. Because one of our biggest challenges is, and we carry this as human beings, is when something bad happens and we bring a worker in to have a discussion around what happened bad, chances are really high, no matter where you are on the globe, that the workers are going to look you in the eye and say, I screwed up. It's my fault. I'm bad. And the reason they say that, I mean, is pretty simple. One, it's much easier to admit that you screwed up early because it's like ripping off a Band-Aid. If you do it really fast, then it's going to be painful for a moment, but then the pain doesn't prolong itself and last forever. Secondly, if I admit guilt, then I'm going to take the heat off my coworkers, which peer pressure is it's the reason I wear pants. It's a strong pressure. And thirdly, is because at the time, the worker truly believes retrospectively that they really should have made a different choice. The problem with retrospect is that it makes mistakes choices. So every mistake in retrospect looks like a choice, but in actual context, it's not. And so our challenge is that we have to understand the worker's a source of information, and that the work we do makes the system better. It doesn't remove the bad things, it puts in the good things. And so when a worker looks us in the eye and says, I know better, I just got lazy and didn't do it, we have to look them in the eye and say, I know it feels that way. But if we stop there, all we've learned is that you're lazy. What we need to learn is the deeper, richer understanding of what's going on in the world around us. And that challenge is a huge, huge, huge part of how we make improvement. Now, these first two ideas, as basic as they seem to us, and I can't say that enough times to you, I know these are really basic ideas. We've had this conversation. You don't even need this conversation. But ultimately, I think it's so important because what I'm seeing are discussions around this idea of improvement and learning that aren't based in these first principle ideas. And so here's what I know. And I think you know the same thing. I mean, we can sort of collectively agree on this, I'll bet you. And that is, if they don't have those first principle idea discussions, then their learning programs aren't going to learn the right things. And they're not going to be effective. And most importantly, they're not going to be sustainable. The way we create long-term change is by changing the basic assumptions we have, the first principles we have about how the world operates. And remember, although I don't feel like I need to say this out loud because it hurts me to say it, but remember, there's an arc to progress, there's an arc to improvement, and it has the ability to move both ways. Organizations ebb and flow. And for all the improvement your organization has made, the potential for them to move backwards, to backslide, is always present and pretty normal. In fact, organizations backsliding is predictable. And when it happens, it helps us understand that we need to go back and have that first principle discussion again. Now, that makes a huge difference. And that's a big, big part of what we want to think about and how we progress. That leads to principle 3. Now, this one's interesting because principle 3 is really the one that talks about this idea of organizational learning. And learning is what you guys do for a living. In fact, it's present in the name of the organization. And it's a big part of how improvement happens. I would suggest, although the research on this is pretty rich, I would suggest that improvement is always a function of the organization's ability to learn. But we're now asking organizations to learn differently. And the ability to learn differently is really the challenge that we want to have. And we're moving organizations from traditional learning methods, which were often pretty didactic, pretty leader focused, classically Tayloristic. Planners are smarter than workers. Leaders are smarter than planners. Therefore, ideas that come from the above and down are always going to be richer, better, faster, quicker than ideas that come from below up, right? It's classic Taylorism. What's amazing is that the ability to learn differently is a direct function of that first principle idea. Remember that we limit our learning by our solutions. The enemy of the question is always the answer. And that as soon as we think we know the answer, we no longer spend time thinking about the problem. And in an organization that is highly attuned to fixing things, right? Engineering centric organizations, manufacturing centric organizations, scientific and research, those organizations really take their pride and measure their progress by fixing problems as fast and as quickly as they can. And so what happens is we oftentimes shorten our ability to learn in order to jump to the fix, because fixing is always sexier than learning. It just is. Our challenge as a group is to make learning sexy. And that's why I'm wearing the big yellow shirt. I mean, I think it really works for me at every single level, and I hope you agree. The biggest challenge we have is based upon the idea that knowing more makes the organization smarter. So the transverse of that is knowing less makes the organization dumber. The only way you'll know more is to know more. I mean, it's just the way it works. I mean, it's how the world is aligned. You cannot know more by knowing less. You can only know more by knowing more, which means we have to, at some level, really build a desire, a need for the organization to get smarter. And the way we can do that, I think, is a real challenge. And if you look around the room and take a moment and look around, you're in the presence of greatness, because you're in the presence of organizations probably sitting next to you, in fact, probably your own, that have really spent time understanding and make sure they've built ways to build feedback back into the system. So you hear about Monday morning calls or weekly calls or after action reviews, right? Or learning from normal work or investigating successes or using learning teams. All of those are tools that actually help increase the amount of learning opportunity we have within the system. If I could change one thing in the whole world, it would be, well, there's a lot of things I would change in the whole world. Let's bring that down a notch. The one thing I would really focus on would be redefining the term operational excellence. Because if you ask me to define what operational excellence is and to build a standard around it, what I would tell you is I would base that standard and that definition for operational excellence entirely on the organization's ability to learn from itself. And I would build a case at every level that said, if we want improvement, the way we get there is improve the way we learn from ourselves. The challenge is we desire seductively unambiguous information. In fact, our systems are set up to reduce ambiguity. And that's what we do. We hate ambiguity. Ambiguity drives us nuts. And so because we want seductively unambiguous information, and I'm going to say that again because I love saying that word, because we want seductively unambiguous information, What happens is we create systems that actually limit our ability to learn context-rich information, which is how we get into software programs in large organizations that force you to use a pull-down menu to choose a cause code. I'm using DOE talk right now, that is the lesser of all the evils. And so suddenly our accounting systems are limiting our learning systems. Now, I don't have a solution for that, and I don't know what that looks like, but I can tell you, if we're ever in a position where we have to choose an answer that we think is less inaccurate than all the other answers that we could choose from, that actually probably is a system that is causing us to not learn. And so I use all the time this picture. You've probably seen it before. And if you can, it's a van with 41 pallets, 61 pallets on top of it. What's interesting to me is asking a group of people what's wrong will almost always lead you back to these first principles ideas, right? Bad guy makes bad decision, makes bad choice, does dumb thing, right? Well, we can talk them through that. We can get them out of that. But ultimately, what we want to do is really focus on the fact that this is a pretty interesting challenge. And that no matter what happens, the one thing we can't say for sure is the guy who put those pallets on that van in Atlanta, he didn't accidentally do that. He didn't turn around and go, crap, I put 46 pallets on top of a van. This was a substantive, technical, organizational, and operational act. And that's pretty powerful. So where's this take us? Well, it takes us to an area that is really interesting for us to talk about. Because our challenge is to really go to this idea of the first principles. And when we're facing the ability to learn, the opportunity to learn, then one of the challenges we have is the realization that we want more and diverse information, not less and simple information. And where this really helped illustrate itself is when we started talking about VUCA. Now, I don't know how familiar you guys are with VUCA, but if you aren't familiar, it's definitely worth looking up, VUCA. And VUCA comes from the military. In fact, it comes from the special forces. And it's a way they looked at understanding really complex operational environments with high risk, which sort of defines the very work your company does. And VUCA is really an acronym for 4 distinct things: volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And the research they've done and the applied use of these VUCA principles is really worth your time, because it says, because the system is volatile, because we don't know what's going to happen next, we have to make quicker decisions faster, realizing we can change, that we have sort of the ability to turn on a dime, right? Because the world is uncertain, we have to create certain capacity for uncertain outcomes. So when we go fishing, we take 3 forms of beer. We take your beer, we take my beer, and then we take a third selection of usually cheaper and warmer collective beer, right? That's creating capacity. We understand that pretty well, right? Complexity, we've talked about before. Complex systems always fail at the couplings, and complex systems are devilish. They always want to fail. And then last but not least is the idea of ambiguity. And what ambiguity says is, when facing the opportunity to learn, instead of circling the wagons and getting more defined and less information, what you do is reach out and actively seek diversity of information, diversity of opinions. I've said it for years, but one of the things that I welcome in any investigation, in any learning document that we create, is a differing professional opinion. Because you actually want diversity when uncertainty and complexity is high. And it seems counterintuitive. In fact, it seems like something that wouldn't even be normal. But I promise you guys that when complexity and uncertainty is high, if you reach out farther and get more and varied forms of information from your organization, you will have more information by which to make decisions. If you learn broader, then you get more and varied information, as opposed to specific pinpoint learning, which traditionally, when the organization's in shock, that's what it counts on. We don't ever want to build a situation where we limit learning. We always want to be able to learn. You know this story as well as I do. If you're doing an investigation and you finished up a series of questions with some workers and you're getting ready to push your chair back and leave and eat a donut, right? It's the perfect time. And as you push your chair back, one of those employees looks you in the eye and says, "Can I say one more thing?" You're definitely going to sit back down, because that next thing that is said, chances are really high, is going to be incredibly important to your ability to learn. And what they're going to tell you is something you didn't ask them. They're going to tell you something that you didn't imagine needed to be understood. They're going to create more diverse and varied information. And as Ron will tell you next, that's the secret to identifying those weak signals. Weak signals become strong after you find the burglar in your guest bed. There was no question that that duffel bag and roller suitcase in my driveway was a big fat warning sign. After, because I'm always smarter after stuff happens. Beforehand, though, I really saw those as a problem that could be solved later. Now, that challenge is a big challenge. And what it does is it helps us understand, and it's really helped us align the need to learn from success. So I think, and you can tell me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the biggest changes that's happened in our profession as a community of learning professionals is the realization that what we've traditionally done is learn from failure. And failure can teach us much. There's no question. Failure is a very, very important learning tool. But it's also put us in a position where we're learning kind of what a system looks like when it fails. What we've had to do is really take the time to learn from normal work. What's happening when nothing bad's happening? That's a classic Eric Hollnagel question. It's perhaps the most powerful question I can think to ask a group of senior leaders. I mean, I don't even know if there is a better question to ask a group of senior leaders than that question. That's ultimately an incredibly powerful question. But the reason it's powerful is because it force functions us as a learning organization to understand and describe what normal looks like. Now, why don't we do that? Why aren't we good at understanding success? Well, a big part of the reason is we have a lot of it. And it's so normal that it kind of doesn't hit the radar screen. So, you know, the old squeaky wheel always gets the grease. Normal, successful operations, which is mostly what your guys do all the time, every day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, except for leap year, 366 days, that's always present. And the thought of collecting normal data is pretty awesome, because we really don't have the time, energy, or even the computer bandwidth to collect what normal looks like. But it is forcing us to really shift the way we think about moving forward. It's forcing us to really understand at a different level that we need to move some of our learning resources away from just understanding failure to looking at normal work, to predicting and understanding normal work, to understanding what keeps the system stable, what's happening when nothing bad's happening. And the tool that has been most powerful, at least in my world, is this one. When we shifted the question from the fundamental attribution error bias, which is who failed, to the much richer operational learning bias question, which is what failed, then what happened is we just got much, much better information. If you do nothing else, and I promise there's a million things you can do, but if you do nothing else, the one thing I tell you to do is do this. Get your organization, and therefore the tools, paperwork, systems, get them so they align towards starting with the system first and then the people second. Traditionally, what we do is look at the people first and the system second. But in fact, that's not the case. That gives us an opportunity to understand the context in which the event transpired, the context in which normal work happens, the context in which workers and clients interface, the context in which daily operations continually take place, and then ask the question, what creates that context in a successful way? Which takes us to the fourth principle. Now, you're starting to see a little drift here, because the fourth principle is starting to look much more organizationally mature. And what's happened is, as these new views have started to diffuse, we're starting to look differently at the organization. And that's the crazy thing about this, is as we get better, we're going to understand at a richer level what's going on. And one of the things is we've learned that behavior, worker behavior, is almost entirely a function of the organizational context. Now, that means we have to design things differently. Things that never happen all the time. And the question I'd ask you is, are your workers exercising free will? Are they free agents in your organization? And remember, this goes back to the first principle, to the whole discussion we have around mistakes. And if so, what role do you play in creating an environment where workers can succeed? So let me ask this question of you. What makes your highest performing best team your highest performing best team? What makes them that way? Why are they that way? What's going on? And what you're going to find is that in that best team, there is a context and expectation that actually drives how workers perform, how workers behave. And the very best example I can give you is this one. Now, I wouldn't answer this out loud, although I'm not in the room, so you can do anything you want to. But I wouldn't answer this out loud. I would use this more as a thought exercise. And here it is. Do you behave differently in a biker bar than you do in church? And the answer is probably yes. I don't know how many biker bars you go to. I mean, we can talk about that later. But the environment in which you are placed really helps set the expectations for how you perform. And so we can build environments where people can actually be much, much more effective. We can build environments where learning is not only a novelty, learning is a normal outcome to operations. And if you look at high-risk teams, teams that do emergent work, rescue, Delta Force, those kind of teams, you'll hear them talk about the expectations of things like an after-action review, right? And one of the things is that is a function of the contextual expectation that's placed on that group. This is pretty powerful because you hear it talked about a bunch. In fact, Jake talked about it a bit, or it was in the title of Jake's presentation, this notion of psychological safety. And when you think about psychological safety, I don't want you to think about psychological safety in such a way that it sounds like it's a warm fuzzy, or my door is always open, or free hugs are available here. I want you to think about psychological safety as an environment in which it's okay to have difficult conversations. In fact, when Amy Edmondson talks about psychological safety, what she talks about is, how easy is it for you to disagree? How far can you push the conversation towards the edge and still feel like it's recoverable? And so one of the things that's so powerful about this idea, and you think about it when you think about culture, all the words, we have lots of words for this, is that what we're really talking about is, what is the contextual environment in which the work happens? And so psychological safety itself is not an individual skill shared by an individual, really super good leader. Psychological safety is always a group dynamic. It always exists as a function of the group's context and the ability to make it okay to disagree. And if you think about it, and I think about this a bunch, I've worked in groups where it's been super okay to disagree. In fact, we had some great disagreements and got better because of it. I've also worked in organizations where it's not okay to disagree. And what's amazing is the organizations where it was okay to disagree performed better than the organizations that were really theatrical, that had one idea and didn't allow much disagreement. Which ultimately takes us to the fifth principle. And this is the one that I think about the most, just because I think this one is the biggest representation of change. And if we go back to our first principle, safety is not the absence of bad things, it's the presence of good things. And we think about how this principle sort of pays into that first principle, this is pretty valuable. But it's a different level of maturity because the old principles were really focused at the worker level. The new principles seem to be much more organizational in nature. So the old principles aren't bad, they're still incredibly effective. The new ones are better at looking more holistically at the organization. And it says simply how leadership respond matters. Now, I think some mistakes happened in this one. And that is that for a while, we took the word leader out. We said how other people respond. Well, here's what I'm going to tell you how other people respond does matter. There's no question about that. But that's way dumb. I mean, that's the answer to that is, of course, how leaders respond specifically sets the color and sets the contextual tone for how the organization will move forward. How the leader responds determines whether the leader creates an environment where they improve or they don't improve. They either get even or get better. It's the old, when something bad happens, you can blame and punish, or you can learn and improve, but you can't do both. And what we're asking organizations to do, and we've been doing this a while, is to simply lead differently. Now, the challenge is that this is a conversation that we have to have. So go back to our secrets. We have to have this conversation with leaders based upon where the leader is, not where we want the leader to be. And so that challenge means that we have to change the way senior leaders, senior managers, senior bosses, gerentes, jefes lead their organization, and it's hard, let alone changing the entire organization. And yet, I'm going to suggest if we don't change the way leaders think, we won't change the entire organization. And Gabe, my friend Gabe, who works in locomotives, he said to me one day, what is perhaps the best incredible comment I've ever heard. And he said the test they use in their organization is this: are we giving leaders the correct data to ask the right questions? Are we giving our leaders the right learning product that creates curiosity in the right places so that leaders ask the right questions? Ultimately, this allows us to work differently, to create an opportunity to change. But it's based upon this idea of the first principles and upon the promise that we'll stop having conversations that make us dumber. What we want to do is build this first principle idea in as richly as we can. Safety is not the absence of accidents. Safety is the presence of capacity. We don't make systems better by taking bad things out of the system. We make systems better by putting good things in the system. And the only way we get to put good things in the system is by improving our ability to learn. And the only way we can learn better is by building on those first principles. That, my friends, is the message I wanted to share with you guys. I hope it worked. I miss being there. I want more than anything to be with you guys. This is such a fun conference. It's great. It's a super good way to get lots of content for the podcast. It's a great way to see everybody, hug everybody, laugh and smile. So do me a favor. The next time you're laughing or smiling, give one for me. Pour one on the ground for your homie, because I wish I were there with you. I want to wish you the best of luck ever. Have as much fun as you possibly can and continue on this journey. Now you get to listen to the fabulous and gorgeous Ron Gant.